awesome speaker. You guys all ready to learn about wildlife? Yeah. All right. So we have Liz Lynch. She is an archaeologist with BLM, and she is here to talk to us about archaeology, being good citizens, and how archaeology and wildlife can intersect.
Thank you, Andrea. Hi, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Liz. I'm one of a handful of archaeologists who work here in Lander with Bureau of Land Management. But tonight I want to talk about something that's less about my on-the-clock work and more the intersection of a couple of my great passions, which is hunting, conservation, and archaeology. Turns out Wyoming is maybe the best place in the country to see how those things overlap. So thanks for having me. We'll dive right into it. I guess before I get started, I just want to ask if you have questions, please hold them until the end. I don't want to lose my train of thought, and Lord help us all if I get down a rabbit hole of something really interesting, we'll never get out of here on time. So, Q&A at the end, hold on to it, look forward to hearing your questions. So, before we get started, I just want to share this quote that I've long loved from one of my personal conservation heroes, Leopold. This is something that I think about often. As an archaeologist in the federal sector, of course I'm most interested in the material remains of what humans were doing in the past. But a lot of my work ultimately is just, for another Leopold phrase, one cog and one wheel of intelligent tinkering in a greater machine that deals with environmental conservation and wise use, multiple use. And so in that context, I think a lot about, humans tending to think of ourselves as separate from nature, but we're very, very much an ecological being. And so as we move through this, I want you to keep that in mind. We think of humans as being separate from nature, but the more that I do this work, the more I realize that is absolutely not the case. Quick run of show. I will give you a quick introduction to myself. Then I will give a quick introduction to archaeology. What is archaeology? Mostly what isn't archaeology? Spoiler alert, if you thought this was going to be about dinosaurs, I'm not going to be offended if you leave right now. No dinos in this one. And then a little bit of a primer on what to do if you come across archaeological sites or resources on public lands. So that includes BLM, Forest Service, Park Service, Fish and Wildlife as in refuges. Really anything that's federal land, these same rules are going to apply. Then we'll hop into the juicy stuff, which is talking about one of my favorite places in Wyoming, the Fremont Lake Bottleneck. There's this really amazing overlap of archaeological materials as well as modern migration data that all kind of happens in the same place. And then we'll use that to kind of talk about, bridging again that gap that we perceive between humans and nature and how each of these sets of data can inform each other so that we can do better conservation work. And then at the end, we'll have hopefully a little time left for Q&A. So, oops. Quick intro to me. I grew up in New Jersey. I got out of New Jersey as fast as I could. I went to school specifically for archaeology. I decided when I was about 5 years old I wanted to be an archaeologist in the West. Now I'm living the dream. I worked all over the place, and then, as luck would have it, I met a guy who lived in Lander, Wyoming, and I slowly meandered my way here. But an important thing that happened when I was in grad school in Montana was that I started to hunt. And in the process of becoming a hunter, really what I wanted was food, good, honest, slow food, and a reason to get outside more often during times of year where I typically was just holed up at my desk, kind of depressed, being like, when will the sun come out again? The answer is like June if you live in Missoula. But over time, my interest in hunting has also expanded to include a lot of volunteering my time with conservation organizations, a little bit of freelance writing about hunting. It's kind of taken over my life in a wonderful way. But ultimately, I've found that I'm a better archaeologist because I am a hunter and conservationist, and I'm a little bit better of a hunter because I'm an archaeologist also, although I'd say it mostly goes the other way. So, what isn't archaeology? dinosaurs, aliens, Indiana Jones. Unfortunately, none of those things are going to pop up beyond saying that my dog is actually named Indiana. But it's important to understand, I think, before we get into this, what it is that I look at as an archaeologist. Generally, I'm interested in the material remains of things that were either made or modified by humans sometime in the past, usually at least 50 to 100 years ago, sometimes more recent, often much older than that, particularly in a state like Wyoming. Archaeology is an inherently interdisciplinary field of work, meaning I had to go to field school and a lot of years of school to do archaeology, but I also borrow techniques and methods from all kinds of different fields, including the ones that are listed below. There are techniques that I use often, such as using GIS to manage data, see where things are in space, but that does not mean I'm looking at dinosaurs. I'm not a historian. I, of course, lean a lot on the work of historians, but I'm not a specialist in documented human history. Knowing geology a little bit helps, but I'm not a geologist. I don't study soils or bedrock or earth structure. And ultimately, I'm also not a geographer, meaning I'm not necessarily only studying the relationships between people and where they are in space or their environment. So, in sum, I'm really interested in what people have been doing in the past and how that shows up physically on the landscape. Some examples of the types of stuff that I'm interested in and I get to work with. We have in the Land of Field Office a ton of really amazing landscapes associated with the National Historic Trails, like the Oregon Trail. So I'm looking at things like grave sites. Sometimes when I'm turkey hunting, I really annoy Jared by taking time to look at the maker's mark on the bottom of a historic glass bottle. And then to the right, you'll see what's called a bow stave, which is a great example of something that wasn't made by humans, but it was modified by humans. It's a juniper where someone took out a great big piece of wood, potentially centuries before now, and used that piece of wood to make a bow. But people who are really good at this skill can do that without the tree dying. And so that's why you see the bark overgrowth covering those chop marks on the tree. These are super rare. If you ever find anything like this, please call me. So moving on, I'm not going to linger here too long because nobody likes to hear a bureaucrat talk about law, policy, and regulation. But I do think it helps you understand why I do what I do. My daily bread and butter is something called the National Historic Preservation Act. The long and short of this is that as an archaeologist for a federal agency, anytime we do a project or we say yes to someone else doing a project, it's my job or my colleague's Nick's job or someone else's job who's an archaeologist to go and see what kind of sites are out there and to think through in a very specialized process whether the projects that we're doing and that we're okay are going to have negative effects on really significant archaeological sites. But the other cool side of NHPA is that it also tells us that we have to preserve things. So just because something is going to get in the way of a project doesn't mean that we get to just destroy it. We have a legal mandate to preserve those really significant sites that we have. A couple of other important laws. NAGPRA is a huge one, although it's not typically a day-to-day use. NEPA, I'm sure a lot of folks in this room are familiar with what that's about, but the key one that I want to hit on here is Archaeological Resources Protection Act, or ARPA. The big takeaway here is that anything that's a cultural resource, made or modified by humans, if it's at least 100 years old, it is protected by this law. Meaning, if you find something, be it an arrowhead, a grave marker, any number of things, you have to leave those things in place and you cannot harm them. They are protected under ARPA. Another neat thing about ARPA is it actually tells me to do stuff like this. Part of how we proactively get out in front of folks, vandalizing or looting when those things happen, often people don't realize that what they're doing is illegal and that it's harmful. So part of my job is to tell you guys about these laws, about these resources, tell you that they're protected, and now nobody in this room has any plausible deniability. So if we ever catch you with arrowheads in your pockets, too bad. So this is kind of a quick recap of all things ARPA. When you find stuff on public lands, always best practice is to leave it where you found it. Beyond the legal considerations from an ethical standpoint, it is best, to the extent possible, for us to leave things where they are. In general, over the course of my career, which is only 13 years, so not that long, even still, I have noticed that archaeologists are trending towards digging less and collecting less whenever that's possible. And there are lots of reasons for that. You know, probably foremost among them is that a lot of tribes have asked us to stop digging and to stop collecting. Part of it is because we ask the public to not dig and to not collect. Part of it is because to do excavation and collection is both expensive and it's inherently destructive. Once we excavate a site, there's a lot of data that is just, it's gone because it's been removed from its context. So archaeologists are moving more in the direction of leave it where you found it. We ask the public to do the same. If you found something really amazing and you want to share it, if you take a photo and you can either take a GPS waypoint or even just kind of point to generally where it is on a map, feel free. I will have some business cards to share, but always feel free to reach out to archaeologists in your area or on the unit that you found it. All we ask is that if you do find a site, please don't share that information about where it is and what's there. Again, these resources are non-renewable, and so we don't want to endanger them. Another best practice, look with your eyes, not with your hands. Mostly, this is important for rock art. It applies to certain other types of artifacts, but if you see rock art and you run your hands down on that, a lot of things that are on our skin surface can cause those rock art panels to erode a lot faster, which obviously we don't want to have happen. And then something I always tell folks is if you have to ask, it probably is. Humans are creatures of extreme habit. We're really good at recognizing the work of our own species. In this photo, it's a little bit hard to tell. I was out in the red desert, and this is a halite or rock salt field, and I was just walking up a path. We were looking for mule deer that day, and I just saw the tiniest edge of this projectile point poking out the surface. But because it's like, oh, that's a really shiny material, I don't know if it's a human tendency or maybe a little bit of like a crow or raven mentality. Had to look at the extra shiny thing that looked almost exactly like everything else around it, and it turned out to be this absolutely beautiful projectile point. But all that to say, we're really good at recognizing our species' own work. So if you're like, oh, this place that I want to camp has a lot of these weird little pieces of obsidian, or I'm not sure if what I'm looking at is a site or an artifact, it probably is. Trust your gut on it. So, out of the bureaucratic goodness into the actual goodness, Fremont Lake, Bottleneck. What I'm going to talk about here is something that was a bit of a pet project for me in a past job. I previously worked on Bridger Teton National Forest for a handful of years, and although I worked out their Jackson office, I was a forest-wide resource. I spent a ton of time down in the Grays, a little bit of time up in Black Rock, kind of all over the place, but between the hunting that I did there and the work that I did there, I started to notice some patterns. And as an archaeologist, that's kind of my shtick, is I need to notice patterns about what I'm seeing, where I'm seeing it. And I started to notice that there were definitely some places on this forest it seemed like it was kind of on the backside of nowhere, or there hadn't been a ton of work done there, but there's a disproportionately high number of sites. And I kind of wondered what was going on with that. And specifically, I started to think about whether there might be some correlation between those backside of nowhere clusters and migration corridors. And that was a result of seeing one of my, I would say role models, but he's like an aspirational figure to me. Larry Todd, he grew up in Wyoming, and I saw him speak about this really, really detailed, amazing work that he did for 20 years in the Absarokas, kind of comparing where wildlife go and where artifacts were. And so I kind of wanted to replicate a little bit of that work to the extent that I could. Larry's really intense about data. He, over the course of about 20 years, generated something like 250,000 discrete data points through the course of doing a bunch of surveys in the Absarokas. And something that I think is really interesting about Larry's work is he does not ascribe to the idea that we should be using arbitrary boundaries of sites. So instead of recording clusters, you can see on this left map, each of those red dots is a single artifact. And what we end up with as a result of that level of detail is some absolutely incredible capacity for further research. So what we're looking at here, again, that map with the yellow and orange lines and the red dots. The red dots are artifacts. The yellow and orange lines represent Arthur Middleton's work on modern elk migration corridors. And Larry started to wonder how much overlap is there between where we find sites, where elk go, and then where we expect things to go. And he found some really interesting kind of mixed results. There are some places, like what's circled in A, where there's really, really great overlap. We find a ton of artifacts in these major migration throughways for elk. Then there are some places like cluster B, where we have a ton of artifacts, but there's no modern migration data. That indicates that elk are going there at all. And so it begs the question, what is going on in these places? More to come on that. Another really interesting finding is the chart in the top right. Don't worry about reading the text. The gist of it is that if you were to compare the types of stone tool materials in cluster A that are inside the migration corridor, that's a lot of obsidian that's coming from places as far away as Idaho or Utah. Most often it's coming from Yellowstone or Teton Pass. Totally different mix of materials than the types of artifacts that were found in cluster B outside the migration corridor, which is also very confusing. Where my mind goes with this is maybe it's different people with a different way of life are more dependent on local animals, local materials, and so they don't travel as far, they don't carry specialized materials with them. It's hard to say. And then the bottom right is just showing the multicolor in the background is an analysis that shows how close things are to water and what the least cost path is. The waypoints are showing artifacts, and then the blue lines are actual paths that elk walk. So you would kind of think both people and elk would want to walk over those least cost paths, particularly in some really brutally steep and rocky country. And it just doesn't quite 100% work out like that. And at times, like right here towards the center, it's showing almost like a mixed preference on the part of people between the least cost path and where the animals tend to go. And of course, I could listen to Larry talk about this stuff forever, but the long and short of it is, I sure wonder if any of these concepts about people overlapping with ungulates, with wildlife that we still hunt today, might apply on BT. So I did what all good bureaucrats do, and I sat at my desk for a really, really long time and ran an analysis, very basic, in GIS, where I created a couple of different heat maps. The one on the left represents areas that have essentially the darker the color, the more there has been archaeology survey done there in the past. The purple on the right is the same kind of heat map, but those darker clusters show where there are sites that are either pre-contact or had a pre-contact component, meaning prehistoric, at least probably 500 years old or more, made by Native folks, not by Euro-American folks. And what I was really interested in finding was those places where we had a ton of these pre-contact sites, but not a lot of surveying. So when I overlaid these, the yellow circles indicate a couple of areas that really stood out. But after listening to Larry talk about migration corridors, I immediately recognized this little circle here as being Fremont Lake. The southern end of Fremont Lake, we'll talk a little bit more about some of the conservation efforts that have happened there, but it is a very significant modern mule deer migration bottleneck, meaning it's a place that pretty much all the deer who kind of have these otherwise individualized paths kind of get squeezed into like one specific place. There's not really anywhere else that they can go in the landscape as they continue either southeast or northwest. Brain starts moving 1 million miles an hour. How cool is it that there's a ton of sites in the same place that currently there's a ton of animals? And so to make this make sense, I first want to talk a little bit about some of those migrations that are happening there. I imagine most of you know Wyoming is an absolutely incredible state with regards to how many brilliant minds are doing really, really heavy-duty research all the time, not just about where pronghorn, elk, antelope, sheep, all kinds of animals are migrating to and from, but also trying to understand why animals migrate, how they learn about these migratory routes. And so, the path of the pronghorn and the red desert hoback mule deer migrations are probably our two best known examples in this state. Some of the data that you see represented here is related to those. There's a lot of question as to why animals do that. It seems generally to kind of be a survival strategy, but it's a really high-risk gamble at times. And one of the neatest things I think about these migration routes and the work happening on them is that, in essence, they're thought to maybe be matrilineal, meaning they're passed on from does, from cows, to their young. Essentially, animals learn from their mothers where to go, when to go there, how to utilize the landscape around them. And as mentioned before, we do get these bottlenecks, which are natural pinch points. Here there are several circled. The westernmost is Trapper's Point, which is both pronghorn and mule deer. To the east of Trapper's Point, in the middle, is Fremont Lake. And then to the east and south of that is more or less the town of Pinedale. So, overlapping all these things, again, thought it was super interesting that we're seeing really not just dozens of sites, but ultimately what is probably actually happening at the south end of Fremont Lake is it's just a continuous cultural landscape. Almost that whole place is a site. The downside is that many of those sites, through a combination of excavation, development, and looting, many of those sites barely exist, if they exist at all. Silver lining there is there have been a lot of other archaeologists who have looked at the existing collections that we have of artifacts from those excavations because they wanted to have a chance to learn more about these sites as our technologies have gotten a bit better. We can learn more things with essentially less damage to the resource. And so what I set out to do was I wanted to look at pretty much all of those site forms, which would turn out to be a massive undertaking, but I really wanted to see if I could find any interesting patterns about things like what kinds of animals are we seeing here? Is there any way that we can figure out perhaps like what time of year people were here? And it turns out that my little gut check on pattern recognition was right, and that there were in fact a couple of patterns to be learned from, both in terms of stone tools and then also the kinds of plant remains and the type of animal remains that we found while scouring those site forms for Fremont Lake. So, starting off with the stone tool types, a couple of real standout patterns. There were a lot of McKean points, as well as rose springs and cottonwood points. For your guys' purposes, McKean is 2,500 to 5,000 years before present chunk of time, very distinctive. Rose springs and cottonwood points are roughly 600 to 1,400 years before the present. So we're seeing that there are these really concentrated periods of use in this landscape. And then when I cross-reference what we were finding through the projectile points there, was that the radiocarbon dates also supported that. There were these really distinct clusters in all of the sites of about the same time frame, which begs a lot of questions about like why this place at these times. More work to come on that. But I thought it was neat. We don't always see that much overlap between our relative ages and our absolute ages. And so there's a really clear pattern starting to emerge there. Another neat pattern that I found was that the number of sources for obsidian was actually pretty limited in these sites. And they really all came from these 5 locations, which are represented by the black waypoints on the right-hand image. Those green waypoints to the east all represent migratory bottlenecks and corridors. And so I love the idea of people, possibly starting somewhere around Teton Pass and actually following the path of the pronghorn, like down through the funnel and ending up at Trapper's Point, hunting them with material that they maybe found here, or maybe in the winter prior, they were all the way down in southeast Idaho. It's a world of possibility, but it really indicates that these are people who are moving a lot, they're interacting with these migratory animals a lot as they go. Next batch of artifact kind of like patterns that I noticed. Plant materials were pretty well analyzed and talked about, which was exciting. There's a lot of sagebrush, there's a lot of pine, and there's a lot of aspen. And the aspen was interesting because there's just not a ton of it left there now. Another thing that really stood out to me is whether it was seeds, entire pieces of plant, there were a lot of plants that I immediately recognized as being edible. And this is one of those like archaeologists really need to get ecological education things, because if I didn't know prickly pear is good food, lamb's quarters and its related goosefoot plants are fabulous. They're like wild spinach, buckwheats, roots have been a traditional food for a number of people for a long, long time. Mountain dandelion. There's a ton of stuff that we're seeing that's essentially in these sites anywhere from 1,000 years old to 4,000 years old. And there's a lot of these plants that are showing up that we know are super nutritious. They're part of a balanced diet when you're eating a lot of game meat. And one thing that I failed to add to this slide that I also thought was cool is we saw a lot of birch. There's not a lot of birch there now, but something that's important to know about birch species. In Wyoming, up in mostly Yellowstone National Park, there has been a lot of work on what's called ice patch archaeology. The idea is that as glaciers and patches of ice we once thought were permanent are melting, we are having a lot of organic materials like wood and bone, and these artifacts are melting out of these ice patches at very, very high elevations. One of the most remarkable finds in one of these ice patches was a dart point that ballparked, I think, at 9,000 years years old, and it was made out of birch. There's another site up in the Yukon, slightly less old, but still in that same Paleolithic age range. What do you know? It's another dark point made of birch. So, thought it was kind of cool that we're seeing a lot of sign of birch being at these sites. There's not a lot there now, but kind of the same as the Obsidian. It's really exciting to think about people who have this landscape scale knowledge, using that knowledge to carry really, really choice materials with them for a long distance, or making decisions about where they go based on knowing those plants or their stones are there. The one downside about this work, though, is that when I looked at the sites that were on Forest Service property, there was not a lot of detailed information about the types of animal bone artifacts that were found in these sites. Somehow they managed to lump bones together of like deer and elk and bison. And so all that I can really say with certainty is that there was not a lot of small mammal present. There was a ton of larger mammals. One of the wonderful things about a couple of these sites with great preservation is we get to see tools. All of the tools that are shown here are made out of little bits of critter bone. So that all on top, someone took the time to whittle that by hand from a long bone of some unknown medium-sized mammal. So possibly a pronghorn, possibly a deer. But overall, I was left with a lot of questions because what I really wanted to know is, are we seeing pronghorn and mule deer in the past like we're seeing them here in the present? And so I expanded my work rather than to just look at Fremont Lake, I also looked at Trappers Point because I knew Jack Fenner and Danny Walker had done some really, really fabulous work to try to understand more fine-grained information about what they were seeing at the Trappers Point bone beds. And what Dr. Fenner did, I thought was really, really neat. He took modern data from wildlife biologists in the state of Wyoming, where they will essentially use certain bone measurements to figure out how far along in fetal development a pronghorn is when it's in utero. And they applied those measurements to the remains of pronghorn that were found in a layer that was about 6,000 years old. And what they found, and like this is so nerdy, but it's really hard for me to talk about without getting emotional about it. What they found was, told you guys, I'm in my feels about it. Essentially, the pronghorn have been going through Trappers Point Bottleneck probably for at least 6,000 years because the date ranges that you see on the right, they were able to use the modern wildlife data to figure out almost precise windows of time where these pronghorn were being killed based on the size of the fetal pronghorn that were found in the bone bed. And so the average date was April 30th, which I bet if you stand at Trappers Point today on April 30th, you are going to see a lot of pronghorn go through there. That gives me chills. I think that's really, really amazing. I want to see more work like Jack and Danny's happen because essentially, again, what the big takeaway here is we are looking at a place on the landscape where humans and these same wildlife species have been interacting, specifically in a migration corridor, for somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 years that we know of. It's probably much deeper time than that. And so there's a ton of possible future work that could happen here. We could look more closely at some of the animal remains that are found at Fremont Lake to try to see, are we finding that same seasonality? Are we finding that these are migratory animals? Lots of questions we could ask there. We can in the future, focus our work on specifically targeting migration bottlenecks because if Fremont Lake is any indicator, this is a great way to figure out some really, really detailed answers to detailed questions about the past. One of the things that came to mind for me was, is there something going on here during these periods of really distinct, intense use that's maybe related to some kind of change in the environment? Are we seeing warming? Are we seeing cooling? Is there drought? Is there something else happening here that's driving people to really target this spot specifically? And then in general, it's not really practical in my line or sector of work, but I do really think there's a lot to be gained from more research-based archaeologists using the same methods that Larry Todd and Jack Fenner do. Getting really, really fine-grained information allows us to ask some really interesting questions about the past and sometimes about the present. But, so what? Who cares? Sounds like a crazy question to ask as an archaeologist because I'm obviously very passionate about this topic. But it's a question that archaeologists don't ask ourselves enough. Not everyone values science for science's sake. So what do we do with this information? We know people have been hunting pronghorn, maybe mule deer, maybe other things here for millennia, but what does that actually mean for our day-to-day lives now? And to that I would say, we only have so many resources to help us make wise conservation decisions. Behind me is an image of what I think is one of the wisest conservation decisions we have ever made in the state, which is the acquisition of the Luke Lynch Wildlife Habitat Management Area. No relation. He sounds like he was an amazing person, but unfortunately we are not. But if you don't know the story of this place, this is on the southwestern edge of Fremont Lake, so it's right in the heart of that migration bottleneck. By chance, when this land was obtained by the Conservation Fund to keep it from being sold on the open market and then subdivided, chopped up to a point where it risked the future of this entire migration corridor. When that occurred, that also served to help preserve human history because just like the entire rest of the south end of Fremont Lake that's in this high-use corridor, that place was loaded with archaeological resources. Again, most of them have been excavated or looted to the point of non-existence. But nonetheless, small acreage, huge impact. But when we only have so many dollars, so many hours that we can commit, I think there's a certain fire that gets lit under a person, or I certainly feel that way, when I realize the depth of time of some of these migratory routes, these stopover routes. That is a strong case that we're making for saying we have to keep this intact. We have to conserve this because we have managed to keep this up for millennia, potentially 6,000 years. Are we really going to drop the ball now because someone wants their fourth home at the edge of the lake that they visit 2 weeks out of the year? I'm not too keen to see it happen. Another really wonderful thing, besides emergency services, is not only do we have this WHMA within that sort of trapper's point to Fremont Lake corridor, we have many, many different layers of landscape scale protections that are happening here. The Forest Service, the BLM, Forest Service has seasonal closures in this area. BLM is an area of critical environmental concern. In the private sector, we have several easements that have helped keep this whole thing intact. But really, the heart of my message, and to harken back to that Leopold quote, is when we protect the history of humans and the history of animals, we're kind of just doing the same thing. Once you recognize that humans are not separate from nature and that our common denominator is the land or the landscape or the ecosystem, however you want to think about it, it's really, really difficult to disentangle the idea of keeping these things intact for hunting purposes or for any other conservation need from the idea of also preserving human history and culture. There are lots of different ways that we can apply archaeological methods and wildlife biology methods back and forth. I will not exhaust you by reading through all of these things. I will let you read them. But the gist of it is there are all kinds of creative ways beyond just the type of work that Drs. Fenner and Todd have done, or even just the really cursory desk exercises that I did, where the more that we support this kind of research, the more that we ask these questions about human-animal interactions or environmental interactions, the more that we can push ourselves in the direction of kind of doing like landscape scale conservation, which as folks who care for wildlife, I think we all know just how important that is, how important it is to make wise land use planning decisions, where we decide to develop and when and how. All of those things kind of become a bit more clear once you realize it's not just about the humans, it's not just about the animals. It's a third thing entirely, which is the interface of those two entities. And so, before I close out, I wanted to make a quick pitch. If you got some free time, tomorrow, a really, really exciting thing is happening at our commission meeting. The meeting begins at 8 a.m. It will be at 950 Buena Vista, which is the convention center here in Lander. As you can see in this very tiny font, the commission is going to be asked to vote to recommend to the governor that the sublet antelope migration corridor be formally designated. I am not the subject matter expert to speak on the significance of that, but I know enough to know it's huge. And so if you think migration corridors are awesome, if you think these places on the landscape should continue to be conserved and wisely protected, feel free to either show up in person if you would like, or you can also attend by Zoom. I think if you want to attend and comment by Zoom, you have to sign up tonight.
Yes.
Where if you go in person tomorrow, you sign up as you enter.
Yes.
Okay. All that to say, obviously archaeology is near and dear to my heart. That's a huge way that I look at these landscapes and why they matter to me. But there's lots of opportunity to, protect it for reasons above and beyond archaeology. It's just one part of it. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you for caring about migration corridors. I'll take questions if you got them.
Of course there are these bottlenecks now, but I kind of know that. And so prior to them putting in Fremont Lake Dam, and then all the subdivisions, so now there are two bottlenecks, Trappers Point and Fremont Lake. But before all the housing and the dam was put in, were they just migrating all up and down Pine Creek, or was there still these bottlenecks? I mean, are the bottlenecks made because of us? Because of us?
And folks weren't able to hear that. The question is whether some of the bottlenecks that we see now in the migration data are a result of human development. And that's an awesome question. That's actually one of the things Dr. Larry Todd was trying to figure out, because he would notice often those, he calls them orphan drainages, places where there were a lot of artifacts, but no modern migration corridors. Oftentimes there was at the end of the rainbow, some kind of development or change, but it was not universal, and so we don't really know if there's causality there. Another possibility is, if you know the rose petal hypothesis, the idea is that starting with those maternal, for lack of a better word, it's kind of culture, motherly culture of where animals go and how. If you accidentally extirpate that line of knowledge, that very specific individual corridor could blink out. And so that's also very much a possibility. Otherwise, I don't have awareness of any indication that animals, particularly species like mule deer that have really, really high fidelity to those corridors in their home ranges, they will just keep going through the same place, through hell or high water. They are not innovators by design. Kind of their survival strategy is knowing how to time their movements in those corridors, but they won't just randomly say, oh, some guy's running his lawnmower, I guess I'll turn south now and see where that gets me. They will just stand there and wait for the lawnmower, which I guess kind of a disappointing answer. There are certainly ways that we could try to understand if there is some real clear driver of why we find those orphan drainages, but to my knowledge, there's not been a really distinct causal relationship. Other questions?
Do you have an example of like where there's been a complete loss of a migration corridor, like a worst case scenario?
You know, I don't have an image of it in there, but there was one that Larry found where his suspicion was essentially the least cost path went through a place that got developed into homes, and there was really, really strong archaeological evidence for people and animals going through there right up until the point that it kind of became a subdivision. But off the top of my head, for our area or for Fremont Lake, again, it's that like, it has such high fidelity to those ranges, it's kind of hard to get them to blink out, but for a lot of modern pressure sustained over a long time.
Thank you.
Do you have any licensing, permits, artisans?
There are some in the state. I do not personally know that. I would call myself a jack of all trades and a master of none, which means I'm really good at working for the BLM, but I could never make it in academia. So they are out there. I would be super curious to know if we have any archaeological evidence for mammoth migrations, and I'm sure a real hard thinker and a hard worker could figure it out, but I won't be that person, sadly. Other questions?
Yeah.
Hi, how you doing?
Pretty good.
Yeah, my name's Steve. And I'm gonna open a can of worms. I'm born and raised here in Land, Wyoming. I'm a native. I'm a Wyoming. I do park arrowheads. I do hunt. I was raised by my grandparents. My grandparents out the old-fashioned way. You're talking migrations and out of animals. Anyhow, yeah, there's numerous things that you brought up that kind of caught my attention. I don't know where you're from, whatever, but first of all, antelope and elk changed places back in the day. Antelope, people laugh all you want, look it up. Antelope used to be mountain animals. Elk used to be desert animals. Out here, limestone. No, I'm sorry, not limestone, but gas hills. They changed places. Elk come down, or I'm sorry, antelope come down the mountain and take places with the elk. The elk was the mountains. Okay, they changed, I don't know why, they was or whatever. Anyhow, as far as migration things go,